Hello and welcome to today's Lunch and Learn, the Federal Helium Program from 1868 to 2023 from the Oklahoma State Historic Preservation Office. Our presenters today are Adrienne Campbell and Justin Edgington with Stantec. Adrienne is an architectural historian with over 20 years of experience in property assessments, historic preservation, and related work. She has worked on a wide variety of projects across the state of Texas and the United States, including highways, military, transmission lines, communication towers, railroads, and public and private development. Justin is a senior historian with 15 years of experience managing and producing cultural resources management projects. He has prepared numerous historic contexts and conducted many historic resources surveys throughout the United States and Texas. Justin is also an experienced HABS large format photographer. Thank you both for being here, and I will turn things over to you.
Okay, welcome everybody. So basically we are going to cover two main things. I'm going to provide an overview history of the Federal Helium Program from basically the late 19th century to the modern day. And then Adrienne is going to discuss the documentation efforts that were undertook by Stantec in regards to the sale of these properties. So first thing I just want to say, the helium program, it's actually very complex, and it has a lot of elements that touch on a lot of different agencies and historical events. So I'm going to try and break this down as a simple as possible, big picture undertaking, because it can easily become an eye-glazing effort if done in detail. But I will say this: I knew nothing about helium prior to this project, other than it was used in balloons. But it is remarkable the amount of applications helium has had in the country's history. And by the end of this presentation, hopefully you will have a much better understanding of how important helium was to the United States. A couple of key things about helium is that the United States was the primary producer of helium for much of the 20th century. And it's an invisible gas. So I wonder sometimes if that's why people don't know as much about it, because it's invisible. But let's get started. So the initial discovery and experimental efforts with helium began in 1868, when separately British and French astronomers identified a line on the sun as a gaseous element using a spectroscope. Prior to that, the idea of something like helium didn't exist. It wasn't until 1895 that a Scottish chemist isolated helium as a new element. And this prompted Europeans from that point into the early 20th century to try and locate sources of helium in continental Europe. However, they were not successful. They couldn't find any. So while that was going on, by 1900, the United States was seeing a rise in natural gas exploration, and a lot of surveys of geological natural gas deposits. And they identified in 17 states and territories had these natural gas deposits. 5 years later, in 1905, Americans David McFarland and H.B. Cady of the University of Kansas discovered concentrations of helium in natural gas samples at a gas well in Dexter, Kansas. So this was a very, very important discovery because it made scientists realize that helium was not a rare element and that it was underground, not some ethereal element that was out of reach. The properties of helium discovered during this time included its lightness and resistance to combustion, which intrigued American scientists who, saw its potential for scientific industrial uses, but really at that point had no idea how to use it. But it did create a lot of curiosity about studying the new element. As part of that, in 1910, the United States established the Bureau of Mines, which initially was set up to monitor health and safety at U.S. mines. But over the next 5 years, the Bureau of Mines oversaw these new research developments with helium. So for much of the 20th century, the Bureau of Mines oversaw the federal program regarding helium. Also, I'll note, this photograph is Dr. Clifford Seibel. We'll talk about him more later, but he's known as Mr. Helium, an important American scientist regarding the initial use of helium. So, as most wars do, federal expenditures during wartime often result in new discoveries. And that was that was the case for helium during World War I. In 1914, the Germans were using hydrogen gas in their dirigibles, they're known as Zeppelins, to do bombing raids in London. And to combat that, British officials began researching using helium as a lifting source for dirigibles. But because there were no supplies in Europe, they reached out to U.S. and Canadian governments regarding the early discovery of helium in natural gas deposits. So in response, Canada established the world's first helium plant in Ontario. In 1917, it did not prove that successful because there wasn't enough helium in those gas deposits. In 1917, Dr. Seibel, seen here, at the University of Kansas, he was doing a presentation on gases within, or helium within natural gas deposits. And during that conference, met with several government officials regarding the potential use for helium in dirigible programs for the United States. And so quickly, the War Department saw the possibilities and funded research for the Bureau of Mines to create 2 experimental plants near Fort Worth, and which accessed a gas field known as the petroleum gas field. And that turned out to be pretty successful in the sense that they were able to produce 150,000 cubic feet of 90% pure helium, which at the time had never been done before. Unfortunately, very little of this reached Europe to aid their dirigible programs for the war. But so most of the stored helium, which was stored in cylinders, was located in Fort Worth. But because of that wartime initiative, a new system for a federal program developing helium was created. So it was a very important period. So following World War I, the initial efforts for the requirements for helium weren't as large, but the Navy, because of the production of helium, started their dirigible program, airships, in 1921. they launched the C-7, which was the largest helium dirigible at the time. And as you see here, it flew over Washington, D.C. in 1921 and created quite a stir. People had never seen anything like it before. And so that was a big use of helium for the Navy's reconnaissance airships at that time in the 20s. Also, after the war, scientists began experimenting with helium for non-military purposes. One significant discovery was the use of helium in deep sea diving. Scientists discovered that by mixing helium with oxygen, they could avoid nitrogen gas, which would cause the bends. And so as more and more of these experiments took place, they realized this element has tremendous possibilities for a number of things: military, commercial, scientific, medical. And on the medical side, helium was used in asthma treatments as early as the 1920s. So as part of this, the federal government realized how critical helium could be to the country, both militarily, but also for research purposes. So in 1925, Congress passed the Helium Conservation Act, or the Federal Helium Act, which created the Federal Helium Program. And it formally authorized the U.S. Bureau of Mines to manage helium, experiment with, produce, purify, and research the gas as much as possible, and to operate large-scale helium extraction and processing plants. So this was the true beginning of the Federal Helium Program, was in 1925 with this act. And so from that came quite a bit of federal monies to develop a program. Now, one of the things that had happened in the early 1920s, a new gas field was discovered by oil companies in the Panhandle of Texas, known as the Cliffside Gas Field. Located about 15 miles northwest of Amarillo, Texas, it was a 50,000 acre gas field that had the highest known concentration of helium and also the largest natural gas reservoir. And as part of this formation, there was something called the Bush Dome Reservoir, which was a very unique rock formation that enabled the storage of helium and kept it from escaping. And that was, no other gas deposits had this kind of geological formation. It was 3,500 feet below the surface, about 300 feet thick, and it covered 12,000 acres of the 50,000 acre gas field. So the government recognized right away, this is a tremendous resource the country has to focus efforts on removing helium from the ground, but also to potentially someday store it because of this unique geologic formation. The helium content at the cliffside was estimated just under 2%, which was quite a bit higher than any other gas fields that had been discovered. And you can kind of see that in this image of a map of the United States, that, these blue gas fields all had content less than 0.3%. Whereas let's just remove that. Whereas this large orange area is the Cliffside gas field. And it's, like I said, it was close to 2%. So quite a bit, a larger amount of helium. Okay, so as part of the build out of the Federal Helium Program, Congress provided monies to the Bureau of Mines to purchase the 50,000 acre Cliffside gas field in 1929. And just prior to that, they began efforts to build the first helium plant in Amarillo to access that gas field. So that it was known as the Amarillo Helium Plant. And it was, by 1929, it was already producing significant quantities of helium. That department, or that office, was led by Clifford Seibel, the one man I mentioned, known as Mr. Helium. And he served as their leader for decades. And the plant became known as the epicenter of government helium research and production for decades. So it was a very, very important place. And all of this was really not well known at the time. Like, people didn't know anything about, the everyday American did not know anything about helium, or that the government had this kind of capability. So basically, the helium plant in Amarillo would create helium and store it in cylinders, which were transported by rail primarily to Langley, Virginia, initially, because that's where the Navy was proceeding with their airship helium dirigible program. And so they needed as much helium as they could get. So these things were shipped by rail. The one thing that did happen, the Navy, by the mid-1930s, had several accidents with these dirigibles, and some servicemen were killed. And by then, they decided to kind of ramp down production of dirigibles. And initially, this caused a reduced need for helium, but that quickly dissipated because there was a rising scientific and medical use of helium. In addition, you had in 1937 the Hindenburg disaster, which showed to the entire world the dangers of using hydrogen to inflate dirigibles or blimps. And as a result of that disaster, the Congress passed a act that essentially provided more helium for non-hostile world governments. So in other words, prior to the Hindenburg disaster, the government was not open to sharing this with other countries. But after that, primarily for scientific, medical, industrial uses, they passed a law saying, okay, we're going to make this available for those kinds of research purposes, with the exception of hostile governments that might use it for military purposes. So shortly after that, of course, World War II began, and that prompted a very large ramp up of the need for helium. And that included each branch of the military used helium gas. This included the Navy's use of dirigibles. Even though they had limited their expansion of it, they still used them in World War II, primarily for reconnaissance of hostile submarines. It was used in rocket construction, welding of ships at ship ports. It was even used during the Manhattan Project for the development of the atomic bomb. So it continually, scientists found new ways to use helium that became vital to not only the strategic interests of the United States, but also to development of medical and scientific research. To meet the demand of the need for helium during World War II, the Bureau of Mines established 4 new helium plants, 2 in Kansas, Otis and Cunningham, and 1 in Texas, Excel, and 1 in New Mexico, Navajo. And these were successful in continuing to meet the demands of helium, both during the war and during part of the Cold War as well. So here's an image of how helium was transported by rail. You can see this right here. That's the United States Navy. So this was helium that was being sent to the helium program for the Navy and their dirigibles. So each of these processing plants had significant rail access, production plants, research areas. So they were quite elaborate in terms of the staff that were working there, and then transporting these things to different locations. So, excuse me. So after World War II, there, just like after any war, there was an initial decline for military use of helium, but research and development continued. This is a image of the Bush Dome geologic structure I was referring to earlier at the Cliffside Field. And it was this level right here, you'll see water. The combination of that plus this large area here of rock enabled these pumps right here, enabled those pumps to extract and helium, and the water and the rock prevented the helium from escaping because it's a gas. And so they quickly realized this was not only great for having the ability to extract it, but to store it. And so the government began to realize we need to conserve this resource. So they started plans for a conservation program at the Bush Dome Reservoir. One thing that occurred shortly after the war was an improvement in welding that allowed for 99.95% pure helium, and that created something called heliarc welding, which was a superior form of welding, which was already, by 1947, was already vastly superior to the welding they were using in World War II. So there was some really rapid advancements following the war. The onset of the Cold War by 1947 increased the national defense use of helium as well. And you started to see that use of helium for military uses increased, but by 1953, the government began to withdraw helium to meet the growing demand for commercial and scientific uses in the fields, for instance, of medicine, meteorology, industrial uses. And this, combined with the increased military use of the Cold War, caused the stockpile to deplete from 87 million cubic feet at the beginning of the 1950s to less than 17 million cubic feet by 1959. So again, this prompted Congress to act to preserve as much as possible the nation's stockpile of helium. And so in 1960, they passed the Helium Conservation Act, which helped to establish a federal stockpile and to create new facilities that would help to replenish the supply. Part of that act also allowed for private companies to manufacture helium. So for the first time in 1960, it was no longer just the government doing it. So there was, after 1960, there was a partnership between private companies and the government to produce helium. And so this here is a map of, this shows the pipeline, which I'll discuss in a minute. But you have the Cliffside field right here, and then the Amarillo processing plant just below it. And there were a number of private helium plants erected during the 1960s in Bushton, Kansas, Ulysses, Kansas, Liberal, Kansas, and then in Texas, in Stratford and Dumas. And then 2 federal plants were constructed, one in Otis, Kansas, and one in Keys, Oklahoma. For example, the Oklahoma gas field in Keys, the federal government established that one as a way to help replenish the supply. And it was related to the Keys gas field, which was discovered in 1943. And the federal government opened the Keys helium plant in 1959, which fairly quickly produced large amounts of helium and helped ease the national deficiency in helium. So as part of this effort to conserve helium, the federal government contracted with a company in Tulsa, Oklahoma, known as the William Brothers Company, to build a 425-mile long federal helium pipeline between Bushton, Kansas, and Cliffside. And you can see that pipeline in this image here. That's that solid line. The completed in 1962, the pipeline connected federally owned helium production plants, as well as the private helium plants in Kansas and Oklahoma, to the Federal Helium Reserve at the Cliffside gas field. So to facilitate that transfer, there were different facilities created, including the Santanta metering station in Kansas, and you can see it right here. And it was placed midway along the pipeline in order to make sure that the gas extracted by private firms was up to the right standards before it reached the federal storage area here at Cliffside Field. And so that's what this facility was. This is just one of many types of facilities that enabled this program to exist. Another one was the Cliffside Field Terminal, which was similar to the Santanta terminal, which allowed the government to regulate the use of, to make sure that the helium was as pure as it could be, and then also help provide access, direct access to extracting from the reservoir. The one interesting thing, these prior to the 1950s, the helium was stored in massive containers above ground. And as the Cold War heated up, military planners realized, that's probably not a good idea to have that visible to potential bombings if there was ever a conflict. So the wells were reconstructed underground with camouflage doors, which helped hide these helium storage areas from any kind of aerial reconnaissance. And then also beginning with the creation of NASA in 1958, helium was vitally important to the space race. The gas was used for a number of things, including pressurizing fuel tanks, purging fuel lines, cooling spacecraft components. Was used in the Apollo moon landing program. It helped detect leaks in space equipment, welding, cooling, scientific payloads. So it was a very, very important element in the development of NASA and its programs in the 1960s. And so basically, by the end of the space race and the end of the Vietnam War in 1975, you started to see demand for helium decreasing again. And throughout the 20th century, this back and forth between an increase in demand and a decrease in demand happened all the time. And so it fluctuated all the time. But by the early 1970s, there was a definite reduction. Private companies adapted well to this decline and found it very profitable. However, the federal government was losing a lot of money with its Federal Helium Program, and so much that by the 1980s, they were in debt by $1.4 billion. And so by the 1990s, there was a concerted effort to reduce the deficit, and the helium program came under a lot of scrutiny. And in 1996, Congress passed the Helium Privatization Act, which terminated the Federal Helium Program. And it required the disposal of all facilities and reserves by 1998. And what that means is just that the federal government would no longer oversee the production, and that it would turn to private companies. So the private companies took over the daily handling of helium processing and production after that period of 1998. And the Bureau of Mines was also ended in the 96 Act, and the Bureau of Land Management took over oversight. But so this kind of marked the end of the Federal Helium Program, which proved to be so important for America's strategic importance through much of the 20th century. And in terms of where that program, that was the biggest shift after it became more private. It no longer resembled how the country both extracted and preserved the helium program. It just no longer followed the same patterns, and it became private. And now, today, there are concerns globally of a helium shortage. And so there are efforts to find additional resources. But yeah, so that was kind of a overall overview of the history of helium. The sale that occurred of these facilities prompted the documentation efforts that we undertook, that Adrienne can now kind of discuss about that. So go ahead, Adrienne.
Thanks, Justin. So after the Federal Helium Program went into so much debt, and the federal government decided to dispose of the program in 1996, ending the program was it's the federal government, so it was a long, drawn-out process. And so that it was in 1996 when that law was enacted, but the privatization took quite a while. And in 2013, the Federal Helium Program still existed, and that's when Congress enacted the Helium Stewardship Act, which continued the privatization of the federal helium reserves, while ensuring continued access to federal crude helium reserves by federal agencies and private industry. It also established conservation and research programs for long-term helium acquisition for federal users. And then that law also required the sale of the entire Federal Helium Reserve take place by 2018. So in 2021, the Bureau of Land Management, who took over from the Bureau of Mines, transferred the Federal Helium System to the General Services Administration, and then the General Service Administration listed the property for public sale. And so this is where cultural resources people like us came into the process. As the Bureau of Land Management disposed of the Federal Helium Program assets, including the Amarillo and Excel plants in Texas, the Bureau of Land Management had to fulfill responsibilities under Section 110 and Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, which I won't get into. I think probably everyone here is familiar enough with it, if not entirely too familiar with those laws. So Excel and Amarillo helium plants were both identified as eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. So their loss was identified as adverse effect, and mitigation for those included the completion of historic American engineering record documentation and other products as well, including interpretive exhibits. In the meantime, helium extraction and production processes by private industry continued to improve. So in 2005, at the Cliffside gas field, there was a new what do I call that? The crude helium enrichment unit was constructed by like a group of private companies, and that was a new structure built to enrich helium to even pure level. And so after the CHU, the crude helium enrichment unit, the CHU, would enrich helium. This was in 2005. This changed the use of the Federal Helium Pipeline, whereas before all the helium was coming in to be stored at the Cliffside gas field. After the CHU was created and it began to enrich the helium, the Federal Pipeline ended up not just a one-way streets. Not everything's coming into, but after the CHU enriched helium, it would be transferred through the pipeline to privately owned facilities. So it changed the use of the pipeline to not just a one-way in coming in helium, but also shipping it back out along the pipeline to these private facilities. So there, I got it. I'm not sure how to switch. Can you do the next one, Justin? Oh wait, I figured it out. I forgot. Okay. So Section 110 again was how we got involved as cultural resource people into this program, and the final resources after they disposed of Amarillo and Excel, the final resources to dispose of were the Federal Helium Pipeline with the Stantec metering station and the Cliffside terminal in the gas field. So so GSA, the General Service Administration, contracted with Stantec to do this work for them, the evaluation and potential mitigation for the disposal of the Federal Helium Pipeline. So our group had previously worked on research and mitigation related to the disposal of the Amarillo helium plant, but regardless of this experience, we are architectural historians, and so we still found ourselves faced with several challenges. Like we'd worked on the previous project, we've worked on other infrastructure projects, but as non-engineers dealing with historic infrastructure always presents challenges of understanding enough about the the function, the design, what's significant, that kind of thing. And then, of course, the pipeline is a buried resource. And so, and not one that's being dug up by archaeologists, it's just a buried resource. So like the pipeline and also the wells, those kinds of things are challenging to evaluate. And then the Bush Dome Reservoir, which is the cliffside gas field where the helium is contained, is a natural formation. And we had lots of discussions about how to evaluate that and and how important it was, because in a lot of cases everyone talked about how unique it was, but at the same time it was sort of referred to in other times as like just a big refrigerator, like just a place to store it. And we had sort of this discussion about the pipeline too, how the engineering was unique, but then as we learned more about it, it really was like the engineering was the same engineering as a gas pipeline. Okay, so there were several buildings at the. Another challenge was that this is the Cliffside Field Terminal near Amarillo in Texas, and it's the the end of the line. This is where the Cliffside Gas Field is, where the Bush Dome Reservoir is. These are the structures that were associated with the federal program here at the end of the line, at the field terminal. So several of the buildings here at the field terminal were less than 50 years old. Older buildings were substantially modified. And so if you can see here in this graphic, you've got decades of construction you've got like 1950, there's just one small building, and then you have 1960 when, the helium program, of course, was established in 62. So you've got some buildings from there, some from 1970, but most everything postdates 1980. And the buildings that were there that were from 1950s through 70s were pretty substantially modified for the most part. And of course, they're all very utilitarian as well. So, and then the submerged portions of the pipeline we just had to presume them to be in good condition since they continue to be operational, except for like capping pipeline branches to the former helium plants that weren't in operation anymore. And the pipeline remained in its original location as well. And the limited above ground portions of the pipeline appeared to retain integrity. So, coming into it, we did not have the sort of full understanding about the pipeline and the program, the Federal Helium Program in general, that we did, that we've presented to you leading up to this discussion. So it took that level of research and documentation for us to formulate our recommendation to the General Service Administration. And what we recommended and they determined was that the Federal Helium Program, the Federal Helium Pipeline, met the National Register criterion of significance under Criterion A in the areas of conservation and industry at the national level of significance. And we also looked at criterion consideration G for things that are less than 50 years old because of its continued use and continued importance to the federal programs and the development of helium in the United States. So we looked at that throughout the whole period, not just the historic period, but leading up until disposal, basically. So, and we were looking and trying to determine what would the period of significance be, what would contribute and what would be non-contributing. We recommended that the period of significance would extend up to 1996, with Congress determining or disposing of the Federal Helium Program. And we determined that because there was consistent and continued use through the duration of that period. And that period is the conservation period from 1962 to 1996, when the federal government was conserving helium at the Cliffside gas field. And it is the only extant helium storage facility of its type in the country. Helium development in the world took place much later. The United States was a major supplier of helium throughout most of the 20th century. And of course, it was developed during the Cold War. And those characteristics, such as the buried and camouflage well cellars and pipelines, demonstrate that that sort of interest in disguise from threats to national security. And then we also, of course, looked at, or not of course, we also considered a period post-dating 1996 for significance, but ultimately determined they're just because of things like the construction of the CHU and the privatization and the the further purification of helium and the change in the pipeline to send helium out from the Cliffside gas field as well. But we ultimately determined they're just, it's too recent, not enough scholarship, not enough time to really establish significance. So in 2020, the helium reserve was the nation's leading producer of crude helium for both private and public sectors in the United States. I should say globally, just 16% of the helium demand. So the United States definitely became less of a supplier to the rest of the world during that period. So when we were looking at the National Register boundary after making this, I guess we should talk about, first let's talk about integrity. Here we go. So again, several buildings at the Cliffside Field Terminal were less than 50 years old. Older buildings were substantially modified. We identified most of these buildings as non-contributing because they either were not present during the period of significance, they didn't relate to the reason the property is considered significant, or they just no longer had significant integrity to convey that significance. And so examples of those were like support buildings and a water storage tank, like a flagpole at the Stantec station in Kansas, and storage tanks and signs. Some of the things dated to the period of significance, but weren't important components in helium transportation and storage as well. So all the new construction within the Cliffside Field Terminal detracted from the historic integrity, but also supported continued use. And when we looked at the system overall, not just this little section near Amarillo, we're looking at the pipeline and its entire length. The resources, the presence and the continued functionality continue to convey its integrity, sufficient to meet the criteria for listing in the National Register because of the exceptional significance of the resource. So, of course, the submerged portions of the pipeline we presume to be in good condition, but the Oklahoma extent of the pipeline was, in consultation with Oklahoma SHPO, was determined to have diminished integrity and was not eligible. But so the pipeline as a whole, we recommended eligible with a period of significance dating through 1996 because of the consistent and continued use, and that clear period ending in 1996 as a conservation period. So the proposed NRHP, the National Register boundary, we recommended in GSA determined was the footprint of the main trunk pipeline, which was the route of the pipeline itself, and then the fence line that delineated the Bureau of Land Management property boundary at the Stantec maintenance station, and the fence line delineating the Bureau of Land Management property at the Cliffside Field Terminal. And then it also included I think 3 specific well cellars and operation cellars that were used for helium injection at the Cliffside gas field, which were outside of that fence line. The gas field is much bigger than the field terminal itself, obviously. And then the footprint of the linear buried pipelines and drip stations that connected those well cellars to the field terminal. So it was, basically a long line from Kansas to Texas with a little spider at the end near Amarillo. And so the Bush Dome Reservoir and the Bureau of Land Management's natural gas lease and the wells that were associated with natural gas production, because that is natural gas production continues at that Cliffside gas field, were not included in the National Register boundary. And then the selected, so the boundaries that we recommended and the GSA determined were encompass the known extent of the built environment specifically associated with helium transportation and storage during that conservation period, 1962 to 1996. So
All right.
I think that's it. Just wanted to see if there's, that's all I had to say. Thank you.